Okay, so today we are going to be going over factoring trinomials, specifically factoring by grouping. We're going to factor the trinomials by grouping. So let's go ahead and get started on today's lesson. Okay, so again, we're going to be factoring trinomials, and we're going to be factoring them by grouping. So the first step is to find two terms whose sum is the middle term and whose product is the last term multiplied by the first term. Step 2 is to rewrite the middle term using these two numbers, the two numbers that you just found, and then you're going to do factoring by grouping. So again, you're going to find two terms whose sum, so when they add up together, it's going to be the middle term. It's going to equal the middle term. And then whose product, so those two terms, the product, the multiplication of those two, is the last term multiplied by the first term. So that's what the product is. So like when they multiply, the two terms multiplied together, gives you what the last term multiplied by the first term is. Then you're going to take your two terms, rewrite the middle term using those two terms, and then you're going to be doing factoring by grouping. So let's go ahead and look at an example. We are going to factor x squared minus x minus 12. So x squared minus x minus 12. X squared minus x minus 12. Okay. How do we factor x squared minus x with no glare? Okay. How do we factor x squared minus x minus 12? Well, again, so you're going to try and find two terms whose sum is the middle term, and then whose product is the multiplication of the two outer terms. So let me go ahead and write that off into the side because it's too much for me to keep in my head. So we're going to go ahead and find two terms that add up to negative x. And they have to multiply to negative 12 times x squared, so negative 12x squared. So two numbers that when you add them together give you negative x, and when you multiply them, they give you negative 12x squared. Okay, what are those two numbers? Two numbers that multiply to negative 12 is negative 4 and negative 3, or positive 3, negative 4 and positive 3. And so when negative 4 plus positive 3 gives you negative 1, and then you just tack on an x to them. So negative 4x and 3x. Typically, you're just going to take whatever your, well, in these examples, you're going to take whatever your variable is here in the addition part and just tack it onto the numbers that you get. So like I was doing, I was looking at the negative 12 first. So what two numbers multiply to negative 12? We have 6 and 2, 12 and 1, 4 and 3. And I'm trying to get two numbers in such a way that they're going to add up to the coefficient here. They're going to add up to the negative 1. So again, 6 and 2, you can only get 4 or 8. Yeah, and then 12 and 1, like 13, 11, 4 and 3, you can either get 1 or 7. We want negative 1. So we have to make the 4 negative and the 3 positive because negative 4x plus 3x gives you negative 1x. And then negative 4 times 3, or negative 4x times 3x is negative 12x squared. So you put the negative wherever it's needed in order to make it add up to the right number and multiply to the right number. Okay, so now that we found our two terms, our negative 4x and our 3x, we're going to take our two terms and rewrite the middle term using those two terms. So instead of x squared minus x minus 12, we're going to have x squared, using our two new terms, minus 4x plus 3x minus 12. We're just rewriting it. Again, it's the same exact thing because when you combine these two together, negative 4x plus 3x does give you negative x. So we're just rewriting it in a different way. Why would we want to do that, right? because the whole point of this is to factor by grouping. And in order to do factoring by grouping, you have to have 4 terms. So what is the next step? The next step is to factor by grouping. So I have another video on factoring by grouping. And how do you do that? Well, you look at the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms, and then factor out the GCF, and then factor out the GCF from the whole thing. So let's go ahead and look at how to do that in this example. We have x squared minus 4x. Looking at these first 2 terms, x squared minus 4x, what do they both have in common? Well, we have x squared minus 4x. They both have in common, we have x squared, x to the first power, take the smaller exponent of the 2. And so we have 2 and 1, so we're going to take a 1. So we're going to factor out x to the first power. What are we left with? X squared divided by x, you're left with x. Minus 4x divided by x, you're left with minus 4. Okay, that's from the first 2 terms. Looking at the last 2 terms, 3x minus 12. Looking at those 2 terms, they both have in common, let's say we have a 3 and a minus 12, so they both have in common a 3. So factoring out a 3, what are we left with? 3x divided by 3, you're left with x. Negative 12 divided by 3 is 4, or negative 4. So minus 4. Okay, now looking at the whole thing, looking at it as a whole. X times x minus 4 plus 3 times x minus 4. They both have in common that x minus 4. Factor that out. Factoring out x minus 4 from the first term, we're left over with x. Factoring out x minus 4 from the second term, you're left over with 3. Voila! And now you have your trinomial factored. So we have x minus 4 times x plus 3. So we went from x squared minus x minus 12. Another way of rewriting that is x minus 4 times x plus 3. Because if you were to multiply this out, you would get x squared minus x minus 12. Go ahead and do that as an extra little bit of exercise. Just make sure you know how to multiply a binomial times a binomial. Okay, let's go ahead and look at another example. We're going to factor 8x squared minus 5x minus 3. So it is 8x squared minus 5x minus 3. So 8x squared minus 5x minus 3. Okay, how do we factor this? Well, again, we want to go ahead and find 2 terms who add up to minus 5x and who multiply by the 2 outer terms multiplied together. So we want 2 terms that add up to minus 5x who multiply to 8 times negative 3, negative 24, so negative 24x squared. So again, they have to add up to negative 5 and multiply to negative 24x squared. So just looking at the coefficients, we want 2 numbers that multiply to negative 24. Like 12 and 2 multiply to 24, but we can't get a 5 from 12 and 2. 8 and 3 multiply to 24. Can we get a 5 from 8 and 3? Yes, we can. So now we got to play with which one's negative, which one's positive. Well, when we add the 2 together, we need negative 5. So that means the 8 has to be negative. So negative 8x and 3x. Because again, negative 8x plus 3x is negative 5x. Negative 8x times 3x is negative 24x squared. Good. So now we're going to take our 2 numbers, or 2 terms, negative 8x and 3x, and rewrite the minus 5x using those 2 terms. So now we're going to rewrite our trinomial as 8x squared minus 8x plus 3x minus 3. So what did we do? Again, we just took our two terms that we found, replaced the negative 5x with negative 8x plus 3x. Because again, once we combine them, it gives us negative 5x. But we don't want to go backwards, right? We don't want to go back to where we came from because we're trying to factor. How do we factor? Well, we're using the method factoring by grouping. In order to do factoring by grouping, you need 4 terms. So that's why we expand our trinomial, make it a 4-term polynomial, and then we can do factoring by grouping. So let's go ahead and do that. 8x squared minus 8x. So looking at the first two terms, what do they both have in common? Well, 8 and 8, they both have in common 8. X squared and x, 2 and 1, they both have in common x to the first power. Factoring that out, what are we left with? 8x squared divided by 8x. 8 divided by 8 is 1. We don't have to write it because x squared divided by x, 2 minus 1 is 1. So x. If you want to write the 1, you can. 1 times x, which is still just x. I guess it's preference at that point. Negative 8x divided by 8x. Negative 8 divided by 8 is negative 1. And x divided by x is just 1. So negative 1 times 1 is still negative 1. Okay, looking at the last two terms, we have 3x minus 3. What do those two terms have in common? Well, they both have in common a 3. So factor out a plus 3. What are we left with? Well, 3x divided by 3 is x. Negative 3 divided by 3 is minus 1. Okay, looking at it as a whole, they both have in common that x minus 1. So factor out the x minus 1. Factoring that out for the first term, what are we left over with? We are left over with 8x. Factoring out x minus 1 from the second term, you're left over with 3. Okay, so we have x minus 1 times 8x minus 3. And that's how to factor by grouping. Let's go ahead and look at another example. Again, x minus 1 times 8x plus 3. Okay. Looking at another example, we have 4x squared minus 4x minus 15. Okay, so 4x squared minus 4x minus 15. Okay. Again, same thing. We want to find two numbers that add up to the middle term of negative 4x that multiply to the two outer terms. So we need two terms that add up to negative 4x that multiply. Negative 15 times 4 is negative 60. So negative 60x squared. So two numbers, or two terms rather, that add up to the negative 4x that multiply to negative 60x squared. What are those two numbers? Well, those two magic numbers are multiples of 60. You always start with the multiples. So we go to 60, multiples of 60, 10 and 6. Can we get a 4 from a 10 and a 6? Yes, we can. So which one is negative? Because when we multiply, one of them has to be negative because we have a negative product. And again, the sum of them has to equal negative 4x. So therefore, the bigger number has to be negative. So negative 10x. Negative 10x plus 6, subtract the 2. So it's negative 4x. Negative 10x times 6x is negative 60x squared. Good, so we got our two magic numbers. Let's go ahead and rewrite our middle term with our two terms that we just found. So now we have 4x squared minus 10x plus 6x minus 15. Okay. Now that we have our 4-term polynomial, we can do factoring by grouping. Looking at the first two terms, 4x squared minus 10x, let's go ahead and factor out the GCF. 4 and 10, GCF 2. both have in common 2, so 2 goes into both of them. X squared and x, we're going to factor out an x. Because again, you take the smaller exponent, so x. So when we factor out a 2x, what are we left with? 4x squared divided by 2x. 4 divided by 2 is 2. X squared divided by x. 2 minus 1 is 1, so 2x. Minus 10 divided by 2 is 5. Or negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5, so we got that. And then x divided by x is just 1, so negative 5 times 1 is negative 5. Okay, looking at the last two terms, 6x minus 15. 6 and 15, they both have in common 3. So factoring out a 3, what are we left with? 6x divided by 3 is 2x. Negative 15 divided by 3 is negative 5. Looking at it as a whole, what do they both have in common? They both have in common that 2x minus 5. So factoring out the 2x minus 5, what are we left over with from the first group? Factoring out 2x minus 5, we're left over with 2x. Factoring out the 2x minus 5 from the second group, we're left over with 3. And there we go. We factored 4x squared minus 4x minus 15. How does it factor? It factors into 2x minus 5, 2x plus 3. Good. Let's look at another one. All right. What do we have next? We have x squared plus 2xy minus 15y squared. Okay, so we are going to factor x squared plus 2xy minus 15y squared. With it, x squared plus 2xy minus 15y squared. Okay. Okay, so again, two terms. We need two terms that add up to 2xy. So it has to add up to 2xy. And it has to multiply to the two outer terms, the product of the two outer terms. So negative 15y squared times x squared is negative 15x squared y squared. Ooh, that is not enough room. So we want to multiply to negative 15x squared y squared. So again, it has to add up to 2xy, multiply to negative 15x squared y squared. Okay, so two numbers that multiply to negative 15 that add up to positive 2. Multiples of 15, 5 and 3. Can we get a 2 from a 5 and a 3? Yes, we can. So the product has to be negative, so one of them has to be negative. When we add them, it has to be positive. So 5 and 3, so 5xy and 3xy. Which one's negative? The 3 is going to be negative. Because when we add them up together, they have to equal positive 2. So 5 minus 3 gives you positive 2. So 5xy and negative 3xy. Using those two terms, let's rewrite our middle term of 2xy. So we have x squared plus 5xy minus 3xy minus 15y squared. Okay, now that we have a 4-term polynomial, we can go ahead and do factoring by grouping. Looking at our first two terms, x squared plus 5xy. Factor out the GCF from those two. We have x squared plus 5xy. They both have in common the x. So factoring out the x, what are we left over with? X squared divided by x is x plus 5xy divided by x plus 5y. Looking at the last two terms, negative 3xy minus 15y squared. They're both negative, so let's go ahead and factor out a negative. Negative 3, negative 15, so minus 3. They both don't have in common an x, but they both have in common a y. So we have y and y squared. The smaller of the two is y. Factoring out minus 3y. So negative 3xy divided by minus 3y. The y's cancel, we're left over with the x. Negative 15 y squared divided by negative 3y. Negative 15 divided by negative 3 is plus 5. Y squared divided by y is just y. Okay, looking at it as a whole, they both have in common the x plus 5y. So factoring out the x plus 5y from the first term, we're left over with x. Factoring out the x plus 5y from the second term, we're left over with minus 3y. Good. So we have x plus 5y and x minus 3y. So as you can see, this, it kind of looks a little scary when it's in the trinomial and you're asked to factor. It's like, oh no, what do I do? But as you can see, factoring by grouping simplifies it a lot. And so again, it's the same process for each of these. Find two terms that add up to the middle term, that multiply to the two outer terms, multiply together the product, and rewrite the middle term and go from there. Factor by grouping. Okay, let's go ahead and look at another example. We want to factor negative 14 plus 6x plus x squared. So negative 14 plus 6x plus x squared. Okay, so again, we want the two terms to add up to our middle term, to add up to 6x. Multiply to the two outer terms, negative 14 times x squared minus 14x squared. So we want two numbers that add up to 6 that multiply to negative 14x squared. Okay, so multiples of 14. 14 and 1. We can either get a 13 or a 15, okay? Yeah, multiples of 14, we have 7 and 2. 7 and 2 can give us 9 or 5. We need 6x. There are no multiples of 14 that give you 6, that add up to 6. There are none. So therefore, because of that, this is not factorable. Just when you thought you had the hang of it, right? So this is not factorable. How do we know it's not factorable? Again, because we cannot find two numbers that multiply to negative 14 that add up to 6x. No two numbers exist. So because they don't exist, you cannot factor it. It's just, so that's not always your first, you can't be like, I can't find two numbers that multiply to the product of the two other terms. So, oh, it must be not factorable. No, like really think about it. Like go through all the factors, start busting out your calculator, maybe there's one that you didn't think of. But in this case, there are no two numbers that multiply to negative 14 that add up to 6. So this one is not factorable. Okay, so on that note, let's go ahead and look at another example of one that is factorable again. Okay, so we have 5x squared plus 25xy plus 20y squared. Okay, so what do we have? We have 5x squared plus 25xy plus 20y squared. Okay, so again, yeah, we could jump straight into finding two numbers that add up to 25xy that multiply to 5 times 20, so 100, x squared, y squared. That is possible, and you can do it. However, there's a shortcut. Whenever you see something that they each have in common, factor that out first, and the numbers become a lot more manageable. What do I mean by that? We have 5, we have 25, and we have 20. They all have in common a 5. So they're all divisible by 5. So go ahead and factor that out first, and then we can go ahead and do the factoring by grouping from there. Then we can find two numbers that add up to that middle term once it's factored out. Because again, it's going to make the numbers a little bit more manageable. Let me show you what I mean. So again, looking at the coefficients, the 5, the 25, and the 20, they all have in common 5. So let's go ahead and factor out the 5. So factoring out the 5 from each of the terms, 5 divided by 5, we have x squared. 25 divided by 5 is 5, xy. 20 divided by 5 is 4, y squared. These numbers are much better. So we have, now looking at just the trinomial, we have x squared plus 5xy plus 4y squared. We want to factor that and use factoring by grouping in order to do that. So we want two numbers that add to the middle term, 5xy, that multiply to the two outer terms, 4x squared, y squared. So two numbers that multiply to 4, 2 and 2, can't get a 5, 4 and 1. 4 and 1, 4 times 1 is 4, and 4 plus 1 is 5. So our two terms are going to be 4xy and 1xy. Okay, the 5 on the outside comes along for the ride. He just hangs out on the outside because we already factored him out. So the 5 just hangs out outside over here. Okay, now we rewrite the middle, the trinomial on the inside. So x squared, and specifically we rewrite the 5xy in terms of 4xy and 1y. So x squared plus 4xy plus 1xy plus 4y squared. And that's it. Okay, now we have a 4-term polynomial on the inside of those parentheses. So just looking at the 4-term polynomial, let's go ahead and do factoring by grouping. So again, the 5 comes along for the ride. Multiply that. Okay, so looking at the first two terms, we have x squared plus 4xy. X squared plus 4xy, they both have in common x. So factoring out at x, what are we left over with? We're left over with x from the first term. X squared divided by x is x, plus 4xy divided by x is 4y, plus we have 1xy plus 4y squared. They both have in common a y. And what are we left over with? We have a 1x, or just x, plus 4y squared divided by y is 4y. 2 minus 1 is 1. Okay. So we have 5 times the factored form of the polynomial here. So again, now we want to factor it by grouping, right? And so again, the 5 comes along for the ride on the outside. Factoring out, I'll just use green here. X plus 4y. Okay, so we have x times x plus 4y plus y times x plus 4y. So just look at the purple, looking at it as a whole, what can we factor out? We can factor out the x plus 4y. So they both have in common that x plus 4y. So factoring out the x plus 4y from the first group, we have x left over. Factoring out the x plus 4y from the second group, we're left over with y. Again, the 5 hangs out on the outside because what we're doing is we're rewriting the first polynomial that we saw, the first trinomial, the 5x squared plus 25xy plus 20y squared. We're rewriting that guy. If we were to forget the 5 and just have x plus 4y times x plus y, we would only get x squared plus 5xy plus 4y squared. But that's not what we want to factor. We want to factor the first one, the first trinomial up here with the 5's in it. So again, we multiply that by the outside. So if you were to multiply all this out and then multiply a 5 into everything, you would get 5x squared plus 25xy plus 20y squared. So this is the product of all three of these. 5 times x plus 4y times x plus y. Okay, one last example. Let's do it. There it is. Okay, so we have 5x to the third y squared minus 10x squared y to the third minus 40x y to the fourth. Let me grab some water. All right. So what do you notice about this trinomial? Is there anything that you can factor out first? Well, of course there is. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said that, right? So what do we have? We have 5x to the third y squared minus 10 x squared y to the third minus 40xy to the fourth. Okay. Five x to the third y squared minus 10x squared y to the third minus 40xy to the fourth. Okay, so we can factor out something that they all have in common. Again, say if you're, going through an exam and you're just, plowing through the problems and you don't realize, hey, I got to factor something out. That's okay. It'll still work. It'll just, my hip popped. It'll still work. The numbers will just be bigger. So you'll have to find two numbers that add up to -10 that multiply to 200. Good luck. Okay, so, well, 20 and 10. But anyways, what do you want to do? Let's go ahead and make those numbers a little bit easier, right? So 5, 10, and 40. They all have in common a 5. So let's take out a 5. And then let's also look at the x's and the y's to see if we can factor out anything from those three terms. Okay, so we have x to the third, x squared, and x. Yes, you go always with the smaller one. So x to the first. So we can factor out x to the first. Y squared, y to the third, y to the fourth. We are going to factor out y squared. So again, we go with the smallest exponent, which in this case is a 2. So y squared. So factoring out 5xy squared, what are we left over with? Well, 5 divided by 5 is 1. X to the third, we took out 1. So 3 minus 1 is 2. So we have left over x squared. We had 2y squared. Okay, we had y squared, and then we factor out y squared. So 2 minus 2 is 0. Okay, so no more y's. Minus, and then 10 divided by 5 is 2, so minus 2. We had 2 x's, minus 1. We have 1 left over, so x. Y to the third, we took out 2 y's. We still have 1 y to the first power. Minus 40 divided by 5 is 8. We had an x. We factor out an x. No more x's. 1 minus 1 is 0. Y to the fourth, y squared. 4 minus 2 is 2. Okay, much better. So we have 5xy squared times x squared minus 2xy minus 8y squared. So again, we have a trinomial. We're going to go ahead and find two terms that add up to -2xy that also multiply to -8x squared y squared. So two terms that add up to -2xy that multiply to -8x squared y squared. So negative 8x squared y squared. Okay, so again, two terms that add up to negative 2xy that multiply to negative 8x squared y squared. So looking at just the coefficients, two numbers that multiply to negative 8 that add up to negative 2. Well, two numbers that multiply to 8 are 4 and 2. Can we get a 2? A negative 2? Yeah. So the two terms are negative 4xy and 2xy. So negative 4 times 2 gives you negative 8. Negative 4 plus 2 gives you negative 2. And again, we just keep the, the term from the addition. So xy times xy is x squared, y squared. So it works out. And then, yeah. All right. Taking those two terms, let's go ahead and rewrite our middle term using the minus 4xy and the 2xy. Okay, so again, the 5xy squared is on the outside. It just comes along for the ride. So 5xy squared times x squared minus, using our two new terms, 4xy plus 2xy minus 8y squared. Okay, 5xy squared comes along for the ride. And then we're going to do our factoring by grouping. So x squared minus 4xy. Let's go ahead and factor by grouping those first two terms. They both have in common an x. So factoring out an x squared divided by x is x. Minus 4xy divided by x is minus 4y. Looking at the last two terms, we have 2xy minus 8y squared. The 2 and the 8, we can factor out a 2, so plus 2. Xy, y squared, they both have in common, so y and y squared. We always take the smaller exponent, so y to the first, 2y. Okay, factoring out 2y from the first term, 2xy divided by 2y. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and then we have x, and then y divided by y is also 1. So we just have x. Minus, negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, so minus 4. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, yeah. Y squared, we factor out a y, we're left over with y. 2 minus 1 is 1 for the y. Okay. So now, looking at it as a whole, 5xy squared, again, that just comes along for the ride because it's multiplied on the outside. Each step, it's multiplied on the outside. So 5xy squared. Okay, now looking at just the purple as a whole. X times x minus 4y plus 2y times x minus 4y. They both have in common that x minus 4y. So take out the x minus 4y, factor it out. Factoring x minus 4y from the first group, you're left over with x. Factoring x minus 4y from the second group, you're left over with 2y. Okay, so ultimately we end up with 5xy squared times x minus 4y times x plus 2y. So that is factoring by grouping, factoring trinomials by factoring by grouping. So there are other ways to factor trinomials. I find that factoring by grouping, I like it. It's, it's the same step for all of them. You don't have to memorize, oh, if this guy, if this one doesn't have the coefficient, there's no extra rules, right? You just straight up, what two terms add up to the middle term, what two, at the same time, those two terms have to multiply to the product of the first and the outer two terms. And again, it's just the same protocol for all of the problems. So again, that is how to factor trinomials using factoring by grouping. Thanks for watching.